The late-night diner encounter. The neon sign of Rosie's Diner flickered against the inky sky, casting a dim pinkish hue over the rain-slicked pavement. Inside, the place hummed with the quiet chaos of a late-night rush, plates clinking, coffee being poured, and the murmur of weary customers drowning in their own worlds. Lena Carter, a 26-year-old waitress with tired eyes and an indomitable spirit, moved between tables, balancing a tray with the ease of someone who had been doing this for far too long. Her shift was almost over, but exhaustion gnawed at her bones like a relentless tide. She had been working doubles for the past 3 weeks, desperate to make ends meet. Her mother's hospital bills were piling up, and her younger brother, Tommy, still had tuition payments due. There was no room for rest, no space for dreams, just the endless cycle of work, pay, and worry. She adjusted the notepad tucked into her apron and let out a breath, forcing a smile as she approached the newest customer who had slipped into a booth near the window. The man was out of place, too polished, too put together for a place like this. The kind of person who belonged in a sleek penthouse office, not a rundown diner that smelled of burnt coffee and nostalgia. He wore an expensive-looking suit, though the tie had been loosened and his dark hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd been running his hands through it in frustration. His presence caught Lena off guard, not because of his appearance, but because of his stillness. Unlike the truckers, college students, and late-night regulars who filled the place with noise, he sat there in quiet contemplation, stirring his coffee with slow, deliberate movements. Lena pushed away her curiosity and plastered on her well-practiced smile. "Evening, sir. Can I get you something to eat?" He looked up, and for a second, Lena forgot how to breathe. His eyes, an arresting shade of stormy blue, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. But then he smiled, and the sharpness softened into something unexpectedly warm. "I'll take a turkey club," he said in a smooth, measured tone. "No mustard, please." Lena scribbled it down, her fingers oddly unsteady. "Coming right up." As she walked away, she felt something strange lingering in the air, like an unspoken question between them. She had no idea why he stood out so much or why she felt as if he were watching her, but she shook it off. She had bigger things to worry about. A mysterious patron. "That one looks like trouble, honey," came a familiar voice. Lena turned to see Ruth, the diner's longest-standing waitress, grinning at her from behind the counter. She was in her 50s, round-faced with a sharp tongue, but a heart of gold. "Who?" Lena frowned, though she already knew. Ruth nodded toward the stranger. "That one. The fancy suit, the brooding stare. Mark my words, men like that don't just wander into places like this without a reason." Lena rolled her eyes. "He's just a customer, Ruth." Ruth snorted. "Sweetheart, I've been serving coffee longer than you've been alive, and I know when someone's got a story." Lena shook her head, grabbing the man's order from the pass-through window. She wasn't interested in stories. She had enough of her own problems. She dropped off his food with a polite nod, expecting nothing more than a standard thank you before moving on to the next table. But instead, the man looked up at her with that same piercing gaze. "Thank you," he said, voice smooth yet thoughtful. "It's rare to find kindness in places like this." Lena blinked, caught off guard. Sure. No problem." He didn't elaborate, just gave her a knowing smile and returned to his meal. As she walked away, a strange feeling settled in her chest, like she had just stepped into a moment that would matter later, though she couldn't yet see how. The note that changed everything. By the time her shift ended, the diner had emptied out. The truckers had gone back on the road, the college kids had stumbled off into the night, and the single mother who had been struggling with her toddler had finally gone home. Lena wiped down the last of the tables and sighed, stretching her aching limbs. She was about to head out when she noticed something on the table where the stranger had been sitting. A napkin, folded neatly, with a $100 bill tucked inside. Frowning, she picked it up. and unfolded it. The words, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, sent a chill down her spine. "You remind me of someone I once knew. Keep going." There were no initials, no name, just the simple yet cryptic message. Lena frowned, her tired brain struggling to make sense of it. What did that even mean? She glanced outside, but the stranger was long gone, vanished into the night like he had never been there at all. As she pocketed the money, a part of her told her to forget about it, to just be grateful for the generous tip and move on. But another part, a quieter, more instinctual part, whispered that this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. A door opens to the unknown. The cold air outside Rosie's diner stung Lena's cheeks as she stepped onto the quiet street. The city lights flickered in the distance, their glow reflecting off the wet pavement. It had rained earlier, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and gasoline. Lena pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself, her breath visible in the crisp night air. The napkin note and the $100 bill felt heavier in her pocket than they should have. She glanced down the street, half expecting to see the mysterious stranger lurking in the shadows, but he was nowhere to be found. Shaking her head, she told herself to let it go. Rich men didn't just wander into diners and change people's lives. She had no time for fantasies or questions with no answers. Her apartment was only a few blocks away, a small one-bedroom unit above a hardware store. It wasn't much, but it was home. She climbed the rickety stairs, careful to step over the loose floorboard in front of her door, and slipped inside. The place smelled like instant coffee and laundry detergent, the familiar scent wrapping around her like a second skin. In the dim light, she could see her mother asleep on the worn-out couch, a pile of unpaid medical bills stacked neatly on the coffee table beside her. Lena sighed, setting her bag down and gently tucking a blanket around her mother's frail frame. She had no choice but to keep going. The note from the stranger didn't change anything. Or so she thought. The call that changed everything. The next morning, Lena was jolted awake by the shrill ring of her phone. She groggily reached for it, blinking at the screen. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello." A familiar voice, smooth, calm, controlled, came through the line. Lena Carter. Her heart skipped a beat. It was him, the man from the diner. She sat up straighter, suddenly alert. "Yes. Who is this?" A small pause. "I apologize for calling out of the blue. My name is Julian Mercer. I was at your diner last night." Julian. So, that was his name. How did you get my number?" she asked, glancing at the clock. It was barely 7 a.m. "From your boss. Timothy Barnes, correct?" Lena frowned. Timothy never gave out employee information unless it was an emergency. Why would he make an exception for Julian Mercer? "Listen," Julian continued, as if sensing her hesitation. "I know this is unusual, but I wanted to offer you an opportunity. One that I believe you'd want to hear." Lena's fingers tightened around the phone. "What kind of opportunity?" "A job," he said simply. "Something outside the diner." She blinked. "I already have a job." "I know," Julian said, "but I think you deserve a better one." The words hung between them like an unspoken promise. Lena didn't know whether to laugh or hang up. Was this guy serious? A man like him didn't just hand out job offers to strangers. "I don't know what kind of scam this is," she said finally, "but I don't have time for games." Julian chuckled. "I expected skepticism. How about this? Meet me today at the Grandwood Hotel, 3 p.m. If you're not interested after we talk, you can walk away. No strings attached." The Grandwood Hotel. It was one of the most expensive places in the city, where the elite dined, where business deals worth millions were made. What the hell did Julian Mercer want with her? Still, curiosity gnawed at her. She had nothing to lose. After a moment, she sighed. "Fine. But if this is some kind of joke." "It's not," Julian interrupted. "I'll see you at 3, Lena." Then the line went dead. A meeting with a millionaire. At exactly 3 p.m., Lena stepped into the Grandwood Hotel's marble-floored lobby, feeling completely out of place. The chandeliers overhead cast a golden glow, and the scent of expensive cologne and fresh-cut flowers lingered in the air. She had spent all morning second-guessing herself. She even almost bailed, convinced this was either a prank or some elaborate setup. But something, a quiet voice in the back of her mind, urged her forward. At the far end of the lobby, Julian Mercer sat in one of the sleek leather chairs, watching her with that same unreadable expression. He stood as she approached, towering over her slightly. Up close, she noticed more details: the slight tiredness in his eyes, the expensive watch on his wrist, the way he carried himself like a man who was used to control. "Lena," he greeted. "I'm glad you came." "I haven't agreed to anything yet," she said, folding her arms. "So, what's this about?" Julian gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit. Let's talk." She hesitated but finally sank into the chair. "Fine. Talk." Julian leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I'm in the process of starting a new investment firm," he began. "One that focuses on helping small businesses, particularly those on the verge of collapse. The diner you work at, for example, is barely keeping afloat." Lena stiffened. "How do you know that?" Julian's lips curled into a knowing smile. "I did my research." "Of course he did. I want to offer you a position on my team," Julian continued. "Someone with first-hand experience in struggling businesses. Someone who understands the reality of working-class life, not just numbers on a spreadsheet." Lena stared at him. Was he insane? "You want me to work with you?" "Me? I'm a waitress, not a business expert." Julian nodded. "And that's exactly why I want you." Lena let out a disbelieving laugh. "I don't know anything about finance, Julian." "I don't need you to." He leaned back, watching her closely. "I need someone with real-world perspective, someone who can help bridge the gap between investors and the people they're trying to help." Lena shook her head. "This is crazy. You barely know me." Julian's eyes darkened slightly. Sometimes it only takes a single moment to recognize potential. Silence stretched between them. Lena didn't know what to say. This was everything she'd never expected. An escape from the diner. A chance to do something bigger. But was it too good to be true? Finally, she exhaled. "What's the catch?" Julian smiled slightly. "No catch. Just an opportunity. The choice is yours." Lena hesitated. Her mother, the diner, the fear of the unknown. But deep down, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years ignited. Hope. Could she really walk away from it? The choice that changed everything. Lena Carter had always made safe choices. She took the practical route, the one paved with hard work and sacrifice, because dreams weren't a luxury she could afford. Now, sitting in the opulent Grandwood Hotel, across from Julian Mercer, a man she had met only days ago, she was being offered something that felt impossible. A way out. A chance to step into a world where people like her didn't belong. She should have said no. She should have walked away. Instead, she found herself asking questions. "This job," she began, voice careful. "What exactly would I be doing?" Julian took a sip of his coffee before responding. "You'd be working closely with me and my team, helping us evaluate struggling businesses and determine the best ways to assist them. We don't just throw money at problems. We provide guidance, resources, and structural support." Lena frowned. "Why me? Why not hire someone with actual experience in finance?" Julian leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes studying her intently. "Because numbers don't tell the full story, Lena. You do. You've lived it. You understand what it's like to fight for every dollar, to keep a business afloat, to serve people who are just trying to get by. That kind of insight is invaluable." Lena's heart pounded. He wasn't just offering her a job. He was offering her a purpose. She swallowed. "What's the salary?" Julian smirked slightly. as if amused by her bluntness. "Enough to ensure you and your family don't have to struggle anymore." Lena's breath caught. Define enough. 6 figures to start. Silence. The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Lena's stomach flipped. 6 figures. She barely made enough to cover rent. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a lifeline. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. I don't know if I can just walk away from everything." Julian nodded as if he had expected that response. "I'm not asking you to decide right now. Take the night. Think about it. But if you say yes, I'll meet you in my office first thing tomorrow." Lena's mind swirled with 1,000 possibilities. What would happen to her mother? Her life at the diner. But more than that, what would happen if she said no? Would she ever get another chance like this? A world of doubts. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her tiny apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to her mother's soft breathing from the other side of the room. Her mother, Ruth Carter, had been a fighter her whole life. She had raised Lena and her brother, Tommy, on her own after their father passed away. She had worked 2 jobs, sacrificed everything for them. And now she was sick. The hospital bills, the constant medications, the specialists. It was a never-ending battle, one Lena had been losing. She sat up, pressing her hands against her face. This job could change everything. Her mother would get the care she needed. Tommy could finish college without drowning in debt. But still, doubt gnawed at her. Was Julian Mercer truly offering this out of genuine belief in her? Or was there another reason? A hidden motive? And if she stepped into his world, would she lose herself in it? A decision made. By the time the sun rose, Lena had made her decision. She kissed her mother's forehead softly before slipping out of the apartment and heading straight to Julian Mercer's office. The building was a sleek glass tower in the heart of the city, the kind of place that screamed power and wealth. She felt out of place the moment she stepped inside. The receptionist, a perfectly polished woman in a tailored suit, greeted her with a knowing smile. "Miss Carter, Mr. Mercer is expecting you." Lena swallowed hard as she followed the woman through the glass doors into a spacious, high-rise office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Julian stood by the window, dressed in another impeccable suit, hands in his pockets. He turned when she entered, a small smile playing on his lips. "Lena." She took a deep breath. "I'm in." His smile widened, just slightly. "Good." Thrown into the deep end. Lena had expected training, guidance, maybe even a slow introduction into the world of finance and investment. Instead, she was thrown straight into the fire. Within hours, she found herself sitting in her first meeting, surrounded by men and women in sharp suits, all staring at her like she was an oddity among professionals. Julian sat beside her at the long conference table, flipping through a file. "This is Williams & Sons Hardware," he announced. "A family-run business struggling under corporate competition. They've asked for assistance, but their financials are a mess." He turned to Lena. "Tell me what you see." Lena's mouth went dry. She glanced at the file, overwhelmed by spreadsheets, financial projections, profit-loss statements. It was a foreign language. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares. She wanted to panic, but then she thought of her mother. She thought of her years in the diner, watching businesses rise and fall, watching people struggle just to get by. And then she spoke. "They're sinking," she said bluntly, flipping the pages. "They've been bleeding money for 3 years. If they don't change their pricing strategy, they'll close within 6 months." The room went silent. Julian smirked. "Go on." Lena exhaled. "They're spending too much on inventory they can't sell. They need to reduce waste, focus on high-demand items. Also, their marketing is non-existent. They're losing foot traffic to bigger chains because no one knows they exist." More silence. Then, to her surprise, a few people nodded. Julian leaned back, pleased. "See, that's why she's here." And just like that, Lena Carter, the diner waitress who had never belonged in this world, became part of it, the shadow of the past. As the days passed, Lena immersed herself in her new role. She worked late into the nights, poring over business plans, visiting struggling shops, meeting owners who reminded her of the people she'd served at Rosie's Diner. But just as she began to feel like she belonged, the past came crashing back. One evening, as she left the office, a familiar voice stopped her cold. Well, look at you now. Her heart froze. Derek Watson, her ex-boyfriend, the one she had left behind, the one she had spent years trying to forget. He stood by the curb, smirking, hands in his pockets, eyes gleaming with something dangerous. Lena's blood ran cold. She hadn't seen him in 2 years, not since he had left her in a mess of debt and heartbreak. "What do you want, Derek?" she asked, voice steady but wary. Derek chuckled. "You've done well for yourself, huh? Working with the big leagues now. Bet you're making good money." She took a step back. "Stay away from me." But Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Come on, Lena. You owe me." Her stomach twisted. She knew what was coming. She had escaped her old life, but now it was coming back to drag her down. And this time, she wasn't sure if she could fight it alone. The ghosts of the past. Lena Carter's world had changed overnight. Less than a week ago, she was a waitress struggling to pay hospital bills. Now she was sitting in conference rooms, talking to millionaires, and helping small businesses avoid the fate she had always feared: failure. But the past had a way of creeping back. And right now, it was standing right in front of her. A face she never wanted to see again. Derek Watson, the man who had once charmed her with promises and left her with nothing but debt and heartbreak. He stood by the curb, hands tucked into the pockets of his leather jacket, a smirk playing on his lips. "Damn, Lena, look at you," he said, tilting his head. "Didn't think you'd make it out of that diner." Lena's stomach twisted. He still looked the same, too good for his own good, but rotten underneath. The kind of man who could talk his way into anyone's heart and out of any problem. "I don't have time for this," she muttered, stepping past him. But Derek moved in front of her, blocking her path. "Come on now," he said, that smooth voice dripping with false innocence. "You really gonna ignore me like that?" Lena clenched her fists. "What do you want, Derek?" His smirk widened. "I need a favor." Of course he did. He always did. Lena exhaled sharply, already exhausted. "I don't have money for you." Derek chuckled, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. "Now that's funny. 'Cause word on the street is, you do." Lena's blood ran cold. "Come on," Derek continued, his voice lowering. "You're working for Julia Mercer, aren't you? A billionaire. You're rolling in cash now, aren't you?" Lena's pulse spiked. How did he know that? She kept her voice level. "I don't owe you anything, Derek, and if you think I'm going to hand over." He grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to remind her who he used to be. "Easy, Lena," he murmured. "I just need some help. A little cash to clear up some things. That's not too much to ask, is it?" Lena yanked her hand away, anger flaring in her chest. "No, Derek," she said, her voice like steel. "I am done helping you." Derek's smirk vanished. His jaw tightened. She had seen that look before, when he realized he couldn't charm his way into getting what he wanted. His voice dropped lower, colder. "You sure about that?" Lena swallowed, standing her ground. "Yes." Derek studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he stepped back, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "All right," he said, flashing another smile. "Too easy. If that's how it is, I'll see myself out." And just like that, he turned and walked away. Lena stood frozen, watching his retreating figure disappear into the night. She had won that battle. But something told her this war wasn't over. The warning. The next morning, Julian knew something was wrong the moment Lena walked into the office. She wasn't late, she wasn't disheveled, but something was off. "Lena," he said, setting his coffee down as she slid into the seat across from him. "Who is he?" Lena stiffened. "Who is who?" Julian's gaze sharpened. "The man who had you so shaken last night." Her breath hitched. "How did he know?" Julian leaned back, exhaling. "I had security watching you." Lena's eyes widened. "You had what?" "Not in a creepy way," Julian said quickly, sensing her alarm. I know how quickly people change when money is involved. I wanted to make sure no one was trying to take advantage of you." Lena sat back in her chair, anger warring with shock. "I don't need a babysitter, Julian," she muttered. "No, you don't," he agreed. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have someone watching your back." Lena exhaled. As much as she hated to admit it, he wasn't wrong. She hesitated before speaking. "His name is Derek Watson," she said finally. "We used to date. He got into trouble, left me with nothing but a pile of debt, and disappeared." Julian's face darkened. "And now he's back." Lena nodded. "And he knows about you." Julian let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Of course he does." Lena bit her lip. "I can handle this." Julian studied her, then shook his head. "No, I will handle this." Before she could protest, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Marcus," he said into the receiver, "I need you to find everything on a man named Derek Watson. I want to know where he sleeps, who he owes, and what he's planning." Lena's stomach twisted. Julian Mercer didn't play games. The trap. Lena tried to go about her work, tried to ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. But 2 nights later, Derek proved he wasn't done. She had just finished a late meeting and was walking to her car when she felt it. The presence. The eyes on her. She turned, heart hammering. And there he was, leaning against her car, waiting. Lena stopped cold. Derek smiled, easy, casual, but his eyes held something darker. "You should have just given me the money, Lena," he said quietly. Her blood turned to ice. Derek took a step closer, voice dangerously soft. "See, now, you forced my hand." Before she could move, a dark van pulled up beside them. The door slid open. Lena's world tilted. This wasn't a request anymore. This was a warning. And she had just walked straight into it. Into the lion's den. Lena Carter had always been good at reading people. She had spent years working in a diner, learning how to spot the kind ones, the dangerous ones, and the ones who wore their smiles like a weapon. Right now, Derek was wearing his smile like a weapon. And the van parked beside him. That was the real threat. Lena's pulse pounded in her ears as she took a slow step back. One wrong move, and she'd be in that van. "Derek," she said carefully, masking her fear. "What the hell is this?" Derek sighed dramatically, running a hand through his dark hair. "See, this is why I hate when people don't listen, Lena. If you had just helped me out, we wouldn't be here." His tone was casual, but the look in his eyes was anything but. Lena knew Derek's games. She had watched him lie, manipulate, and hustle his way through life, always acting like he was in control. But this was different. This wasn't just a con. This was a trap. She glanced around, heart racing. The parking lot was mostly empty. A single street lamp flickered above them, casting long, sharp shadows. The van's sliding door was still open. A man sat inside, broad-shouldered, tattooed hands, expression unreadable. Lena's stomach twisted. Who the hell was that? Derek saw her looking and smirked. "Don't worry, sweetheart. You're not in any danger. We just need to have a little chat." Lena clenched her fists. "No, we don't." She turned, ready to run. Derek moved fast. Before she could take another step, he grabbed her wrist. Hard. "Not so fast," he murmured, his grip tightening. See, I'm out of options here, Lena. And that's bad news for both of us. Lena yanked her arm, but his grip was like iron. Panic surge. Think, Lena. Think. She needed to stall. You think kidnapping me is gonna get you what you want? She snapped, trying to keep her voice steady. Derek's jaw ticked. No, but it might get Julian Mercer to pick up the phone. Lena froze. Her blood ran cold. This isn't about me. Derek wasn't just after money anymore. He wanted Julian. A dangerous game. Lena's mind raced. Derek was many things: a liar, a scam artist, a manipulator. But he wasn't the kind of man to take risks like this. Which meant he was desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. Lena forced herself to breathe, to slow her racing thoughts. Julian isn't going to help you, she said, her voice calmer now, more controlled. Derek narrowed his eyes. You sure about that? You think he's just going to hand you money? Lena scoffed, stalling. Julian Mercer doesn't play by anyone's rules but his own. Derek's grip tightened. That's why you're going to convince him. Lena swallowed hard. She needed a way out. Fast. Her eyes flicked to the van again. The tattooed man inside was watching, but he hadn't moved. Yet. Could she break free? Her only chance was to get Derek off balance. She took a slow breath. And then she acted. With all the force she had, she drove her knee up, hard, into Derek's ribs. He cursed, stumbling back just enough for her to rip her wrist free. Run. Lena spun and sprinted. She didn't think. She just ran. Her heart pounded, her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. Behind her, Derek shouted, and she heard footsteps pounding after her. But she had one advantage. She knew this area. She cut down an alley, barely dodging the overflowing dumpsters, and took the side exit to a convenience store. The cashier looked up in surprise as she burst through the door, panting. Hey, you okay? Lena's mind whirled. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't go home. Derek wasn't going to stop. And if he was desperate enough to involve Julian, that meant she was already in deeper than she realized. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed the only person who could fix this. The power of Julian Mercer. The phone barely rang twice before Julian picked up. Lena. His voice was sharp, on edge. What's wrong? She didn't waste time. Derek. He tried to grab me, she gasped. He was waiting outside my office. He has a van. There was another guy. A long, dangerous silence. Then, where are you? Lena looked around. Dale's Market, off 3rd Street. Stay there, Julian said, voice calm but lethal. I'm coming. The line went dead. Lena gripped the phone tighter, her pulse still wild. She didn't know what Julian was going to do. But she had a feeling Derek had just made the worst mistake of his life. The wrath of Julian Mercer. Lena Carter had never heard Julian Mercer sound like that before. His voice, usually smooth and controlled, had turned into something lethal, something dangerous. And it scared her, not because she feared him, but because she feared what he was going to do. She sat inside Dale's Market, her back pressed against the cool metal of the refrigerator doors, trying to slow her breathing. The cashier, a scrawny teenager with shaggy blonde hair, kept glancing at her nervously. You want me to call the cops? He asked. Lena shook her head quickly. No. The last thing she needed was to explain to the police that her ex-boyfriend had tried to throw her into a van. She had bigger problems now. Because Julian was coming. And if Derek thought she was his problem before, he had no idea what he had just unleashed. The arrival. It didn't take long. Maybe 10 minutes after Lena had hung up, the air outside the store changed. A sleek, black Aston Martin pulled up to the curb, the kind of car that didn't belong in this part of town. And then Julian Mercer stepped out. Even though she had been expecting him, Lena felt her breath catch. He wasn't just a man in a suit anymore. Right now, he looked like a man on a mission. Like a man who was about to burn down a city if it meant protecting what was his. He strode into the store, his navy blue coat billowing slightly with the force of his movements, his sharp blue eyes locking onto her the second he walked in. Lena had never seen him like this. Cold, unreadable, dangerous. She stood quickly. Julian, I. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Are you hurt? He asked, voice low and deadly. Lena swallowed. No. I got away before. Julian exhaled sharply, like he was barely keeping his anger in check. His hands flexed at his sides, and for a moment, she thought he might punch something. Instead, he took a slow, controlled breath and turned to the cashier. You didn't see anything. The kid nodded quickly. Nope. Saw nothing. 0 things. Julian's gaze snapped back to Lena. Get in the car. Lena hesitated. Where are we going? Julian's jaw tightened. To fix this. The reckoning. Lena didn't argue. She let Julian lead her outside, into the car, where the moment the doors shut, he pulled away from the curb like a man with a plan. Lena glanced at him. You're not going to do something stupid, are you? Julian's fingers tightened around the wheel. Derek Watson made a mistake today, he said flatly. Now I'm going to make sure he never makes it again. Lena's heart skipped. Julian, you can't just. Julian shot her a look. She swallowed her words, because whatever she had been about to say wouldn't have mattered. Julian had already decided. And Julian Mercer wasn't the kind of man who changed his mind. Derek's final warning. They pulled up to a warehouse near the industrial district, a place Lena didn't even know existed, and standing outside, waiting, was Marcus, Julian's head of security, a man Lena had only met once, but never wanted to be on the wrong side of. He was tall, broad, and looked like he had broken more men than Lena had served coffee. He nodded at Julian. We found him. Lena blinked. Wait, you already found Derek? Julian didn't look surprised. Of course. Marcus smirked. Your ex isn't as hard to track as he thinks. Lena's stomach tightened. She wasn't ready for this. She had imagined telling Derek off, maybe getting a restraining order, but not this. Not Julian Mercer hunting him down. Julian turned to her. Stay in the car. Lena's pulse spiked. No way, she said, pushing the door open. I started this. I'm going in. Julian's jaw ticked. For a second, she thought he might argue. But then, he sighed. Fine, he muttered, but stay close to me. And then he led her inside. The confrontation. Derek was in the center of the warehouse, hands bound behind his back, seated on a crate. His face was bruised. His lip was bleeding. And he looked furious. The moment he saw Lena, he let out a bitter laugh. Jesus, Mercer, he spat. Didn't think you were the type to rough a guy up over a girl. Julian didn't even blink. He stepped forward, danger radiating from every inch of him. I don't care about you, Watson, he said calmly. I don't care about your problems. I don't care about your debts. He leaned in, his voice dropping to something deadly. But you made a mistake the second you put your hands on her. Derek's smirk faltered. Julian continued. So here's what's going to happen. You are going to disappear, permanently. You are never going to contact her again. You are never going to step foot in this city again. Because if you do, Julian tilted his head. I won't be this nice next time. Lena's breath hitched. Because Julian Mercer wasn't bluffing. And Derek knew it. His eyes flickered toward Lena. You really got yourself a Prince Charming, huh? Lena crossed her arms. She was done being scared of him. I got myself a real man, she said coolly. Something you'll never be. Derek's face twisted with rage. Julian turned to Marcus. Take him somewhere far away, he said. Somewhere he won't come back from. Marcus grinned. With pleasure. Derek struggled as Marcus grabbed him, but it was over. Julian had decided his fate, and now, Derek Watson was just a bad memory. The aftermath. When Julian and Lena walked back out of the warehouse, the night felt different, like a storm had passed, like she could breathe again. Julian opened the car door for her. She hesitated. What now? Julian studied her, then said simply, "Now, we go home." Lena exhaled. For the first time in years, she finally felt free. She slipped into the car, and Julian followed, the engine purring to life. As they drove into the city lights, Lena stole a glance at the man beside her. Her life had changed in ways she never imagined. And somehow, she knew this was just the beginning, a future she never expected. Lena Carter had spent most of her life fighting for survival. She had never expected to win. Not like this. Not with Julian Mercer sitting beside her in a luxury car, navigating the city streets like a man who had just erased a problem from existence. The neon signs of late-night restaurants flickered past. The streets were mostly empty now, just the occasional headlights cutting through the dark. Lena should have been scared. Julian had just handled Derek Watson in a way that normal people didn't handle things. But instead of fear, all she felt was relief. She glanced at Julian's calm, unreadable profile. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. Julian didn't take his eyes off the road. "Yes, I did." A beat of silence. Lena swallowed, pressing her fingers together in her lap. "I could have handled it myself." Julian smirked slightly, but there was no humor in it. "No, Lena," he said softly. "You shouldn't have had to." Her throat tightened, because no one had ever said that to her before. A new life begins. Julian pulled up in front of her apartment, but before Lena could step out, he reached for her hand. It was a small, simple gesture, but it sent a shockwave through her. She turned, meeting his eyes. "Stay," Julian said quietly. Lena blinked. "What?" "Stay with me tonight." Lena's heart slammed against her ribs. It wasn't an order. It wasn't even a demand. It was an invitation. And for once, she didn't feel like just another person in the background of someone else's life. She hesitated for half a second. Then she nodded. A different world. Julian's penthouse was everything Lena had never experienced. Glass walls overlooking the city, sleek black furniture. A kitchen that probably cost more than her entire apartment. It was cold, empty, perfect. And it didn't feel like him. Lena kicked off her shoes, wandering toward the massive windows. Below, the city stretched endlessly, glowing and alive. "This doesn't seem like home," she murmured. Julian stood beside her, watching the skyline. "It isn't." Lena turned to him. "Then what is?" He didn't answer right away. And when he did, it wasn't what she expected. "I don't know." For a moment, they just stood there. The tension between them shifted, no longer about business, no longer about Derek, but about something else entirely. Lena had spent her whole life believing she wasn't meant for anything more than survival. And Julian? Julian Mercer had everything. But neither of them had ever really had someone. And now here they were. A future worth fighting for. Lena didn't know what came next. She didn't know if Julian would stay in her life, or if he would disappear like a storm passing through. She didn't know if she would stay in this world of power and money, or if she would walk away. But for the first time in years, she had something she never thought she'd get again. Hope. She turned to Julian, a small smile playing at her lips. "You ever had diner coffee?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering to make me some?" Lena smirked. "I'm saying next time, you're coming to Rosie's Diner. My treat." Julian chuckled. "Deal." And just like that, the future didn't feel so impossible anymore. For the first time in her life, Lena Carter wasn't just surviving. She was finally living.